David stopped running, made himself stop. He was tired of running in fear. He walked toward the towering cross, and it loomed larger and larger before him. And as he got closer, he began to see it for what it really was. It was indeed a cross, but he realized it was upside down. It loomed high above him. He studied the building it was sitting upon. It seemed to be a church, but he couldn't help thinking it was some giant tomb instead. Not forgetting why he had started to run, he forced himself to look back at that dreadful factory. He didn't know what else to call it. The massive door, the high dark window where he was sure some sinister, lurking terror still watched him. And as he was looking back, he felt a violent tremor in the earth. The hell? An earthquake? The air grew ice cold around him. Panic swelled up again. Then, everything changed. He saw the shadows of the trees and the surrounding graves rush past him on the ground. He saw his own shadow move toward, under, and then past him. He looked up in horror as the sun overhead streaked across the sky and sank low in the west behind the tomb. Half running, half falling, he reached the door and with all of his strength threw it open and all but jumped inside. He turned and with just as much force slammed it shut, falling to the floor as he did. He barely heard the sound of the door as it reverberated in a cacophony of long, dreadful echoes. He waited, listened, tried to control his breathing. He half expected something to burst through the doors and devour him whole. But nothing came. All was still. The earth was still. He slowly, painfully stood up and looked around. He tried to force what had just happened out of his mind. It wouldn't do him any good wasting his energy on something that could not be explained. And his list of things that couldn't be explained was very long. Somehow this thought gave him something close to comfort. He turned around and took in his new surroundings. There were lights everywhere, flickering, yellowish, red, low, throwing wild shadows all around. It gave the illusion that the room was moving. Candles. There were candles along what he perceived as the walls. As his eyes adjusted to the low light, he could see some of the candles were recessed and placed within the walls. He looked up. The ceiling appeared to be high. The flickering candlelight barely reached. He thought he could see horrible things up there, things hanging down. The faint outline of something slowly swinging and creaking. He looked away quickly. There were rows of what must be pews on either side of him. Indeed, a church, he thought. What else could it be? But he remembered the upside-down cross that towered above this building. Well, perhaps a different kind of church, he thought. Having some point of reference now, he realized he was standing just inside of the massive front door and was facing into the place. Directly ahead, he could just barely see the very far wall and more candles set at different heights. He could also see some reflections. He assumed there might be glass along the back wall. He was shivering, partly from exhaustion and fear, and partly from the intense cold. He knelt and dug into his pack for a brighter light. Would it work? Probably not. He got out water, his lightweight insulated jacket, and a wool beanie for his head. Somewhat situated, he felt slightly better, and the water, though nearly frozen in the skin, revitalized him. He didn't even want to think about going back outside right now. He would camp here if he could. Try to get warm, try to focus, try to make a plan. His survival training was acting as pure instinct. The flashlight, surprisingly, turned on, and the ultra-bright 12,000 lumens sliced through the darkness like a knife edge. He stood, and with his light, he mapped the entire place. The pews looked ancient, and he noticed they were not wood, but stone. The floor was dirt and roughly leveled. The walls appeared to be large, roundish stones set crudely, and candles all over the place. And in this moment, he realized he had been avoiding a very important question. The one he didn't ask himself immediately upon seeing these candles. Who lit them? He started to call out, but stopped himself. He was quite sure he didn't want an answer at this point. Whatever was happening to him, it simply couldn't be some elaborate prank. Not with the time loss. Not with the time lapse? What else would he call it? What had happened with the sun? What had he witnessed? He had seen, with his own eyes, the sun streak across the sky as if he were watching a movie on 100 times speed. He pushed it away for now. He shone the light above, and something between a gasp and a scream was forced from his body. A massive cross hung from the ceiling, and upon it a body, crucified, naked. The head was covered in some hideous black sack. The skin looked bone white, but with areas of black. He decided all at once it was clearly worse in here. He all but ran into the door and tried to open it. He fumbled with his hands. There was no latch, no handle, no knob or lever. There was nothing to grab. He fumbled wildly. He threw his body against it, slammed himself into it, trying to break it open. Pull, not push, he screamed at himself. But there was nothing to pull on. He cursed loudly as he tried to get his finger under it, but there was no gap anywhere. He couldn't even feel the door budge. It didn't give even slightly. It was as if it had been welded shut, solid, like stone. Winded, he gave up. He needed to be in control here. He needed to stay calm despite how he was panicking. He forced himself to look back up. The cross slowly swayed and turned. It was almost imperceptible. The body, from what he could tell, did not look decayed. That could mean it was fresh. He hated to use that word. Or it meant it was just too cold. It was close to freezing in here. He looked away. Think. Someone must be here. These candles didn't light themselves. This person didn't crucify and hang themselves up there. He shone the light straight ahead, down the aisle between the pews, and saw a massive altar. He wasn't a religious man, and he had no idea what the place where a preacher would stand would be called. A pulpit, maybe. He realized the semantics of it didn't matter at all. He moved toward it, He needed to fully explore and know what was here and what he could use. A window, a door. He hated the idea of sleeping among the dead. The altar, like most everything else, was stone. It was covered in wax and God knew what else. It stood maybe 4 feet high with a huge stone slab laid upon the base of it, creating a table of sorts. Candles ringed the outside edge, giving the top an eerie glow. He turned to the back wall. There were no windows, no doors, just more stone. And the reflections he had seen from the front were what appeared to be shards of glass. Walking closer, he saw that they had been stuck between the small gaps in the stones, and they jutted out, sharp, like wicked broken teeth. He could see no other way out of here, aside from the seemingly sealed door. The little bit of spirit he had sank dramatically. He wanted to make a fire, eat, and sleep. But he realized, even if he had had the wood to do so, he could not risk a fire in here. He had no idea if there was anywhere for the smoke to go. He could easily suffocate in his sleep. A wave of exhaustion hit him, and he swayed on his feet. He decided to gather some of the candles and place them together on the ground, making a campfire of sorts, he thought. He got out his sleeping bag, sat down with his back to the altar, and forced himself to eat some dry jerky, washing it down with water. He felt his eyes closing, and his body in no uncertain terms was telling him to sleep. He got into the bag, and while trying not to think of the crucified body that hung above him, he drifted into a deep, dark, and very troubled sleep.